Assalamu alaikum study. God willing, we will be reading from Surah 43, verse 3. Let's all seek refuge in God from Satan the rejected. We have rendered it an Arabic Quran that you may understand. It is preserved with us in the original master, honorable and full of wisdom. Should we just ignore the fact that you have transgressed the limits? And the footnote for 43.3 says, Arabic is the most sufficient language, especially in expressing commandments, statutes, and exacting laws. Hence the revelation of the Quran in Arabic for the clear understanding of all peoples regardless of their tongues. See Appendix 4 for the details. And footnote for verse 5 says, this refers to our original sin as detailed in the introduction and Appendix 7. So we see in these verses that God says that He has made the Quran in Arabic so that it can be understood, because the Quran contains laws for us that are written down in Arabic, so that we're able to not get confused about what the laws are. And it's a language that is very rich in vocabulary, as it says here in the footnote. So it says, see Appendix 4 for the details. And if you look at Appendix 4, it basically gives us some examples on why the Quran was written this way, And God says that in 44, that the sincere believers will have access to the Quran regardless of their mother tongue, But for the disbelievers, even if it's in even if they are the professors of the Arabic language, they will not be able to grasp the Quran, So it doesn't matter how much knowledge people have of their Arabic, Sometimes people just like to throw out their excessive knowledge of the Arabic language, just to show that they're knowledgeable about the Quran, And we see that a lot of those people are some of the most misguided people. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you know Arabic, you're misguided, right? But a lot of people come and they try to impress people with their knowledge of Arabic, and a lot of people will think that they have to know Arabic to understand the Quran, but that's not really God's law. However, it is the most efficient language in the world to describe things, because there's words for everything that distinguish. For example, it gives the example here that the word they in English does not tell you if they are males or females. In Arabic, there is a they for the males, hum, and they for the females. Hunna, there's even they for two males, and humma and they for two females, hatan. So Arabic is a very rich language, and then also it gives us examples of the word qalata for 28, 23. For example, translates into four English words, which means the two women said, right? So we can see, and then also another reason for having the Quran in Arabic is it says that he and she does not necessarily imply natural gender. So then when God is referred to as he, does not really imply gender at all. God be glorified, he's neither male nor female. The usage of he to refer to God in the English language, for example, has contributed to a false image of God. You see this false image of God with like the beard and all that, with white hair and all that. But it says this was not held by such distorted expressions as Father when referring to God. You never find such a reference to God in the Quran. So basically, to understand, God's attributes and everything, and to understand the laws, and have to describe them efficiently in a language, God chose Arabic as a language of choice too. Of all the hundreds of languages in the world that are currently spoken, God chose Arabic to deliver the Quran for this reason. And verse 5 talks to us about God says, well, verse 4 says, it is preserved with us in the original master, honorable and full of wisdom. So people can make any changes they want, they can do anything they want with the Quran, but the actual text of the Quran, which is in Arabic, the actual Arabic, the original master record is with God. And so, it is preserved with God, and so nobody can do anything to destroy it. Basically, God has the original master, and we know that it's mathematically coded and everything. So but verse 5 talks about the part that is referring to our original sin, as mentioned in the footnote in Appendix 7. So our original sin was the fact that when Satan came with the supercilious idea that he could be a god besides God, we failed to side with God. We failed to make a firm stand with God, and we decided to come to this planet and witness it, and we refused to repent when we were given a chance to do so. And so God says, should we just ignore the fact that you have transgressed the limits? And so God decided to come up with the elaborate plan, as we read in the following verses, to address that. The plan for redemption. We have sent many a prophet to the previous generations. Every time a prophet went to them, they ridiculed him. Consequently, we annihilated people who were even more powerful than these. We thus set the example from the previous communities. So God decided to send a lot of prophets and messengers to people and send them the message, send them the guidance so that people could be redeemed. But every time, these prophets and messengers went to people, they were ridiculed. And consequently, God says, these people were annihilated. And so this is God's system, If you continue to defy God, if you continue to, oppose God's messengers, this is what people can expect, And so when people ridicule the messengers, make fun of them, or make negative remarks towards messengers, this is to show their disbelief, or to show their hostility. I mean, this is what God says that they get, to just get annihilation, retribution, because you're actually fighting God, So this is something that obviously people don't understand, and then obviously they will regret it later. If you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they would say, the Almighty, the Omniscient, has created them. He's the one who made the earth habitable for you, and created for you roads therein, that you may follow the right way. He is the one who sends down from the sky water in exact measure to revive dead lands therewith. Similarly, you will be resurrected. He is the one who created all kinds in pairs, male and female. And he created for you ships and livestock to ride. As you rest on top of them, you shall appreciate such a blessing from your Lord and say, glory be to the one who subdued this for us. We could not have controlled them by ourselves. We ultimately return to our Lord. So, these people do acknowledge God, and so God says, if you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they would say Almighty Omniscience created them. But obviously, they have idols, they still have idols, which stops them from believing and becoming believers. And God says, God is the one who made the earth habitable for us, who made the conditions on earth in a way that makes life possible on this planet. And so God is the one who did that for us. And God says he's the one who created the roads for us. The earth could be shaped in such a way that we couldn't build roads, or it could be or no roads could be possible. But God made the surface of the earth in a way that's stable and could be, carved and changed to make roads. And naturally God created a setup that the earth formed many different roads naturally, and then God allowed us the ability to create paved roads on top of that as well. And then God says, so that you may follow the right way. It's a blessing from us that God has put all these things in place. Imagine if there were no roads, if there's, how difficult things would be. You'd have to travel through middle of, places that could be dangerous. But God, creates a safe way and a convenient way for us to be able to travel. And He sends down water from the sky to revive dead lands. I mean, this is a blessing from God that we cannot take for granted. If you don't have rain for a year, you can imagine like how life will, wither away very quickly, and drought, and we see how things are affected by droughts and stuff, and how it affects economies and everything else. So this is a blessing from God that He sends down from the sky water in exact measure. So He knows exactly how much water is evaporated and how much water goes down, and how much water comes up. And so it's all measured by God, and the amount of water that goes up is the same amount that comes down. So this is all designed by God to keep everything balanced and fresh and circulating all the time. And God says you will be similarly resurrected. So it's something that we see every day, and God says our resurrection is pretty much the same as these plants. They are also from the earth. They're part of the earth. Earth is a submitting creature to God, and God, we're made of the same earth, and so we're gonna follow the same idea. On the day of judgment, God will allow us to be resurrected in the same manner out of the earth, just like the plants germinate from the earth. So we should not have any doubt about that. And also God says He created all kinds in pairs, male and female. And so God is the one who made reproduction possible, and He made all the creations in pairs, and so this is a blessing from God, also a proof from God that shows His immense power and His omnipotence, that He's able to multiply the creation, infinitely through reproduction using pairs, and He made this possible, in a way that, even though God is not physically here in front of us trying to produce creations, but He makes the process possible for people to happen, that even animals and creatures like snails and creatures that should have no interest in reproduction, but end up reproducing, right? Even plants and flowers and everything else that cannot reproduce for themselves, God created mechanisms for them to be able to reproduce, and God created pairs for them, and He created ways for these creatures to find each other and mate and reproduce, and this is God's amazing power that God is describing us here, and it's a blessing from God. And God says He created for you ships and livestock to ride, and so again, this is talking about convenience and the blessings that God has given us. He has given us ships. He has given us livestock. Ships will carry you, thousands of miles that you otherwise won't be able to travel, and all our goods that are transported this way from around the world, God makes it possible. Also livestock, we have camels in the desert, for example, and horses and mules, for example, and donkeys, especially in like treacherous mountainous areas where you can't even have cars go, but you do have these animals that God has subdued for us, that will go through the most dangerous routes for humans to help us, and God says, as you rest on top of them, we have to say this, I mean, you can say it in your language or you can say it in Arabic, but, it's something that when you ride uh, uh, these rides, whether it's a ship or livestock or anything else for that matter, God has subdued everything for you. I mean, there's people that say you shouldn't say that. Only you're supposed to say that if you're riding an animal or a ship, not if you're riding a car. But I mean, cars were not there when the Quran came, so it cannot say cars, and then people be wondering like, what are cars? But the idea is to appreciate God for things that He has given us, and so we should say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, La ilaha illallah when we ride, when we start our car. But also we should say this to appreciate God as well as the verse indicates, because a car is no different from a ship, for example, and or an animal in that sense. I mean, these are all things that God has created for us, and so all you're doing in this verse, you're appreciating God. Glory be to Him who subdued this for us, so God made it possible for especially animals, when you think about it, right? I mean, animals literally have a mind of their own, right? And so mm, I mean, God, only God makes it possible that they listen to us and allow us to take them wherever we want. God said, and we say we ultimately return to our Lord. And so that part is also a reminder for us that to God is our ultimate destiny. Our final destination is to God, and so this also keeps us informed about the hereafter and aware of the hereafter. Angels as daughters of blasphemy, verse 15. They even assigned for him a share from his own creation. Surely the human being is profoundly unappreciative. He has chosen from among his creations daughter. Has he chosen from among his creations daughters for himself while blessing you with sons? When one of them is given news of a daughter, as they claim for the most gracious, his face is darkened with misery and anger. They say, what is good about an offspring that is brought up to be beautiful and cannot help in war? They claim that the angels who are servants of the most gracious are females. Have they witnessed their creation? Their claims are recorded and they will be asked. They even said, if the most gracious willed, we would not have worshipped them. They have no basis for such a claim, they only conjecture. Have we given them a book before this and they are upholding it? And so the footnote says, the idol worshippers cannot blame God for their idolatry, since we have absolute freedom of choice to worship God alone or not. So, so we see that humans blaspheme about God in different ways, and obviously Satan is the one who makes them do that, because the moment you start attributing lies to God, I mean, you start worshiping the devil, and then it's idol worship, right? So an idol worship is an unforgivable offense in itself, but then also literally they create daughters. They say angels are God's daughters and they worship them, and God says, I mean, where do you come up with these ideas? I mean, were you there? Were you witness to all of that? I mean, why are people making up these lies? And who would believe them? When people start saying things like that, why would anybody believe that? And you don't even God is telling humans, like a lot of humans, they don't even want daughters for themselves. So why would they want that? Why would they think that God would want? And as far as God is concerned, I mean, God doesn't need daughters or sons or anything like that. I mean, it's us humans in this world that we have to reproduce, as we were reading earlier in the other appendix. God is not male or female, so He doesn't reproduce like we do. I mean, this is just a mechanism that God has created for us here on earth to reproduce, and God doesn't have like a generation or anything like that to carry, and so God doesn't need all of that, any of that. And um, so uh, the other thing is, as we see in verse 20, you know, people always um, people always blame God for their idolatry, and this just happens. Like, I think this happens every single time people do that, and so um, people should not be blaming God for their idolatry, but people end up always creating a reason to blame God for all of this. And I mean, even with smaller things, people will blame God. And for example, with the idea of circumcision, also, like, I think I've seen that, people blaming God for it. That, if God wanted, He could have said this to the messenger, and He could have said that, He could have done that, and we would not be doing this right now. And so you can't blame God for any of this, because God has sent the clear message, and God says worship God alone. So if you have any kind of idols, if you're worshiping any idols, and you're following your own ideas, I mean, don't blame God for it, because on the day of judgment, none of that will be accepted. And speaking of that, inherited traditions condemned, verse 22 says, the fact is that they said, we found our parents carrying on certain practices, and we're following in their footsteps. Invariably, when we sent a warner to any community, the leaders of that community would say, we found our parents following certain practices, and we will continue in their footsteps. The messenger would say, what if I brought to you better guidance than what you inherited from your parents? They would say, we are disbelievers in the message you brought. Consequently, we requited them. Note the consequences for the rejectors. So this is something, quite puzzling, because, a messenger of God comes with a lot of proof and a lot of miracles to people to follow them. But yet it is so easy for people not to follow the messenger. They look for excuses and ways not to follow them. But when it comes to their parents or whatever they're inherited, they'll just do it blindly, without question, without seeing any proofs, without seeing any miracles, and they'll just follow their parents blindly. And I mean, this is, God says, a human tragedy. Many people will go to hell because of that, because they are just following their own parents blindly. And I mean, it's very clearly stated in these verses. They say, we found our parents carrying on certain practices, and we'll follow in their footsteps. And the messenger says, no, just follow this. They're like, no, we'll follow what we found our parents doing. And so it's a lot of that, comes to your ego, because you think that you're somebody and your parents are somebody, and what they're doing, you carry on that legacy, and whatever else, their twisted mind dictates, they decide to choose that over God and guidance and redemption. And so the leaders, it's interesting that it mentions the leaders. It says, invariably, when we send a warner to any community, the leaders of that community would say, we found our parents following certain practices, and we will continue in their footsteps. And so, communities have leaders. Obviously, when you're all following God, God is naturally the leader, the one that we all follow, right? And we don't idolize anybody besides God. But when you're following other than God, right, and you're all following a certain pattern or a certain innovation, right, then you have a leader, because the leader is telling you to follow that, and a bunch of people are following the same thing. If they didn't have a leader, they would all be following different things. I mean, the believers have a leader who's God and the messenger, and they follow that, right? But then the people who have innovated ideas, they have leaders as well. They could be scholars, they could be religious figures that, they blindly trust, and that happens. So, I mean, wouldn't it be wrong to have leaders in the sense of imams that God says, that guide people, that help people? But obviously, when you have leaders that are leading people to hell, then that becomes an idol, and that is all bad, obviously, because not only are they themselves going to hell, they're taking a whole bunch of people with them, even in the millions sometimes. And I mean, so this is disastrous, but this is Satan's way of misleading the people. He works on people, he misguides them, he nurtures them in whatever way he can, gives them all the tricks and things that he needs to be equipped with to mislead people and to deceive them, and then they go and they deceive everybody else. But this idea of the parents blindly of falling on certain practices, I believe circumcision is a very good living example for us to see that in our lifetime. But there, and obviously, looking around us, people of other religions, doing the same thing or similar things, many of them, and so they don't want to give up what they find their parents doing, and most people will identify with the religion that they are born into, and very rarely people will pause and think about what they want to follow or evaluate, guidance. And so this is something that we can see in the footnote. I mean, in the subtitle. The subtitle says, "Inherited traditions condemned," and there's another subtitle that says, "Examine all inherited traditions." So it's a commandment for you. It's your responsibility, not anybody else's, because there could be many traditions. Different people could have different traditions. There could be hundreds of traditions around the world. I mean, they're wrong, and so it's not the messenger's job to keep count of each and every one of them and name each and every tradition of every culture and say, don't do this one and don't do this one. And they just say, examine all traditions. If it's not in the Quran, if it's not from God, as you find here, you will not do it. And apart from that, you cannot blame God for any of this. If you do it and say, no, God didn't mention, or the messenger didn't mention this tradition or that tradition by name, if it was so prevalent and all that kind of stuff, obviously, with God, he says it's not going to work, because we all bore witness that we're going to worship God. It's a monotheism is a natural instinct that God has placed in us, and God has clearly given us a message on what we need to follow. We need to follow only what is in the Quran. So all these other traditions that people inherited, we have to discard them. I mean, and the messenger of the covenant, also clearly says, you have to get rid of all those things, he says, right, in the video for the 1989, the final conference that, he had his, final speech, which was very significant, and we see how he talked about in this masjid, Satan's point of view, he said, is going to be represented. And it's no surprise that 6 years later, the same people, after he passed away, 6 years later, the same people started propagating other ideas contrary to the Quran very shortly. And so, that explains the warning. And God says, consequently, we requited them, note the consequences for the rejectors. And so, people who propagated these ideas, God says we should not be deaf and blind to their consequences, right? I mean, we should look at those things and we should take heed, and the example I had in response to circumcision, the person who propagated this ended up dying of cancer and had a miserable ending, right? And so when you see that happening, this should have been an eye-opener for people, because God says, people should learn from it and take heed. This is why God does that, so people take heed and don't follow in that. But, people who are destined for hell are not going to see that, and we can see that they believe, oh yeah, so-and-so went to paradise, straight to paradise, So we know that the life and death of a believer is very different, and so a believer will not go through, annihilation process as specified by God in the Quran. They will have success in this world and the hereafter. But God says, consequently, we requited them and note the consequences for the rejectors. Abraham's example. Abraham said to his father and his people, I disown what you worship. Only the one who initiated me can guide me. This example of Abraham was rendered an everlasting lesson for subsequent generations. Perhaps they redeemed their souls. Indeed, I have given these people and their ancestors sufficient chances. Then the truth came to them and a clarifying messenger. When the truth came to them, they said, this is magic and we are disbelievers therein. So God has given us the example of Abraham here, and a very detailed account of the life of Abraham. Obviously, Abraham was a founding father of submission to whom God revealed all the religious practices of submission, including salat, zakat, fasting of Ramadan, and Hajj. And so, God describes everything in detail about Abraham and how his example is an everlasting example for us to follow. That, he stood up against the world and people around him, and despite the pressures of the society, and he claimed that he's not going to follow any of the idols that these people worship. He's going to follow God alone, and he's going to worship only one God. Only God can guide him. God says he never was an idol worshiper, so he completely put his trust in God and decided to worship God alone. And God says we rendered his example as an everlasting example for people for generations to come, right? And so we know that he also disowned his father. When his father, he realized that his father was destined for hell, and we're supposed to do the same. We're supposed to run for our lives from people that we know are destined for hell and are only just trying to drag us with them, which they all are. So we should try to run away from that. And God says he has given us examples. He has given people sufficient chances. Then the truth came to them, and a clarifying messenger came, for people, and they said this is magic and we're disbelievers. And it's true of, every messenger that comes. Messenger comes to, clarify the teachings from God. Yeah, so the messenger comes to clarify teachings from God, and so people have to follow the truth. But they come up with such poor responses to the message. They minimize it by calling it magic and trick. And we see the same about the so-called Muslims, what they say about the mathematical miracle. And they think it's a way to deceive people. God will now continue reading verse 31. It says, Muhammad ridiculed. They said, if only this Quran was sent down through another man from the two communities, Mecca or Yathrib, who is prominent. Are they the ones who assign your Lord's mercy? We have assigned their shares in this life, raising some of them above others in ranks, in order to let them serve one another. The mercy from the Lord is far better than any material they may hoard. So when Muhammad was sent as a messenger, he was no exception. Right now they're worshiping him as a god, but when he came with the message, that they were supposed to follow, because they were idol worshippers, they were following other idols, and then they said about Muhammad that they didn't find his status in this world impressive enough to want to believe him. They wanted him to be a big shot, and they said, if only if it was some prominent guy from one of their to popular communities that they would want to follow him. But God says God is the one who decides that, and those things, worldly ranks in terms of popularity and wealth and respect, in terms of monetary value of people's worths. I mean, all these things are decided by God, and they're there for a purpose. Just a setup that God has put in place for people to serve one another, to make this process on earth work, and for us to be tested. And so it has nothing to do with messengership. A messenger doesn't have to be rich, and the messenger's job is to deliver the message and deliver efficiently, and his worldly, status, should not come into equation, and really, this is a way also to expose people's egos, right? Because first they have to be tested by the fact that there is a person that was chosen to be a messenger and it wasn't them, right? But then on top of that, there's somebody who's not even prominent, like people will bow down in the worldly sense to people who are rich and powerful from the worldly sense, but they will not do so obviously with their egos. It's harder for them to do with somebody who is maybe equal rank or even poorer or worse, right? And they will not do that. So, but it's a hard test for it was a hard test for them, especially one because he was a human being. He was just like them. They weren't chosen, and then on top of that, they see he's not prominent, and so God says these are just ways and means for people to test and serve one another in this world. And God's mercy is far better than any material people may hoard. So looking at someone's financial status, to judge them, and to see their wealth, true wealth, right, is wrong. Perspective. God says, the best among you are those who are the most righteous. So people should try to compete in righteousness rather than in their worldly status. Obviously, when you follow God, God will give you everything. So, but the thing is, if people choose to be in this idea that they have to compete with others in terms of worldly success, in terms of worldly finances and things, then such people will never be happy. Obviously, they'll want better and better, and when they get to that point where they have more than anybody, even then, they will still not feel good. So because they just had their priorities messed up, and so people should try to become more and more righteous, because on the day of judgment, that's the real wealth. I mean, your eternal life, your eternal ranking, the real ranking is what that depends on. This worldly life is temporary, and it's just a test, right? Nevertheless, we have to strive in the cause of God, right? And we have to seek His provision so we can strive in the cause of God and be charitable, and things like that, right? But to make it a priority, and forgetting about the hereafter is not something that God wants, and He wants us to have a mindset to become more and more righteous and to be able to redeem ourselves. This is why we are here. We're not here in this world just to make money, or to make money at all for that matter. We're here to be redeemed. The purpose we were created here in this world is to show that we can worship God alone, and we should always keep that in the back of our minds. Materials of this world, all the disbelievers get. God says, if it were not that all the people might become one disbelieving congregation, we would have granted everyone who disbelieves in the most gracious mansions with silver roofs and stairs upon which they could climb. Their mansions would have impressive gates and luxurious furnishings, also many ornaments. All these are the temporary materials of this lowly life. The hereafter at your Lord is far better for the righteous. So really, this is expanding more or less on the same thing, that the worldly materials are nil. On the day of judgment, they're not going to save anybody. And so if it was not that everybody will become a disbeliever, God would give disbelievers everything, all the worldly materials they want, right? But then this wouldn't help because everybody would become a disbeliever because they won't be able to resist the temptation of all the wealth in the world. And so you really, God says we will all become disbelievers. This whole world, it says, if we're not that, all the people might become one disbelieving congregation. So, I mean, that's how bad it is, right? But God says if that wasn't the case, God would give, them all of this stuff, right? That we read here. And so we see a lot of people have disbelievers are so rich as in terms of worldly financial success. It doesn't mean anything to them. It doesn't make them happy or anything. It doesn't solve any of their problems because true happiness comes from worshiping God alone. So the more righteous you are, the happier you will be, and the stronger you will be as a soul, and you'll be more successful in the hereafter, and this is a real success. And this is what God wants us to know. And God says this is far better and more righteous. Invisible devilish companions. Anyone who disregards the message of the most gracious, we appoint a devil to be his constant companion. Such companions will divert them from the path, yet make them believe that they are guided. And the footnote says, each one of us has a representative of Satan as a constant companion, Appendix 7. So basically, all of us are born with a companion, in this body of ours, we have our soul, which is the real person, and then we also come with a jinn, which is a descendant of Satan. And so his idea, he more so pushes Satan's idea, and a constant argument goes on ahead, as we can see in Appendix 7 as well, right? But the thing is that with people who disregard God's message, God already knows who those people are, and so he partners their jinns to be more wicked, to be devils. The God says there are devils among the jinns and humans, or jinns are not devils. Some of them are submitters, and some of them are more righteous, and so God will pair them in this manner, right? They're companions, and so the companions that are given to the disbelievers, the rejectors, they are the companions that are actual devils, and they're the real bad ones, and they are tricksters in the way they deceive people. You will have a companion that will make you believe you're on the right path. They're the worst people, and yet they believe they're the best, right? And this is how good, quote unquote, like bad their jinns are. They make them believe that they're guided, and such jinns are given to them, because they deserve that. Obviously, it's not easy to convince them, right? But obviously, if they're powerful enough and wicked enough and skilled in the way they do these things, they'll make their companions, the human companions, believe that they're doing the right thing by doing all the most terrible things, So may God continue to guide us and keep us away from the whispers of even our companions, no matter how good they are, But may God allow us to convince our companions to help us become more righteous, So with that, God willing, and if you guys have any comments or questions, please feel free. Thank you.
MashaAllah, God bless you both.
Thank you.
MashaAllah, brother. I had a question about the last thing that you said about the jinn companions. And the question is there a way that we can know and understand if they became submitters or they are still like on the side of Satan? Is there a way, or is it like we don't know if our companions are submitters or not?
Well, personally, like, I don't know if there's a definitive way to know they're submit. For us, we can't even tell if we're, really submitters or not. In the sense that it can be tricky, right? someone may think that they are a believer and then they could be hypocrites even, for example, right? So in the same way, like, finding if your jinn's a real submitter or not, I mean, you can guess, I guess, or just look at signs by the way, like, the arguments take place in your head. I mean, the temptations and the ideas, like, for example, the Messenger of the Covenant talks about how your jinn will wake you up for your dawn prayer, for example, right? So things like that, you can see that, will actually indicate whether or not, your jinn's submitting or bad. But really, you can, if you're a believer, I mean, and then most likely you will convince your jinn to become a submitter, right? But you can't tell if your jinn's already a submitter or not. I mean, it's hard for us to make that call, I'd say, because naturally, that means that you will be far ahead of your jinn also. So you'll be a good submitter for your jinn to be a submitter, and it's like I said, it's so difficult to even tell if you're a submitter, let alone your jinn. I mean, that's how I look at it. But you know.
Yeah, mashallah. The messenger says also, like, we need to try to convince them to become submitters, right? We need to
Mm-hmm.
discuss them with the situations, like
Mm-hmm.
the message that we got, like, tell them, can't you see that this is the truth, etc., right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like, if he helps you to do the dawn prayer, right? He wakes you up. Like, how can we know that it was him who helped us? That's actually, is there, like, you
Um,
understand what I mean?
Brother, if you're not dragging yourself out of bed and you're so, excited to get up and to do your prayers, then, it's a sign that, the jinn is weak, it's getting on the submitter's side. That's what I have felt. Like early in submission, when our souls are weaker, they tend to be stronger. But then as we become, stronger in belief, then they also become stronger. That's my observation. I mean, so far, and even when you wake up in the middle of the night, you still, you're excited to meditate instead of going back to sleep. And these are, could be signs. MashaAllah.
Yeah, Jaffer, ask more easier questions.
Yes, sir.
But we should not, let our guards down and think that they're just okay. We should always be aware that there is like a representative of Satan in us. And also they like studying the miracle over and over, going through the appendices really helps. Reading the submitter's perspective, watching the messenger's videos, and meditating on points that the messenger says, they also help. And they need like reminders every day. And when I find myself like wandering off and like going to YouTube and doing things that are not very productive, I feel like the gene is activated. So I go back and try to feed more submission information to the gene to make sure that she's studying rather than just wandering off and just being stupid or being satanic. Yeah.
If there are no other questions, can I ask an off-topic question?
I think let's just comment a little bit on the verses, and after that we can go to off topic. I mean, we read a lot of verses, so okay. I guess if there are no questions about the verses, we could go to off topic.
Yeah, Michelle. So, in the office, there is a friend of mine who asked this question actually. He is, mashallah, interested in submission, and he is doing lately, studies, etc. And he asks me sometimes questions. And yesterday he asked me about Jesus, and he said, in the Quran, God says to the Prophet, be a Muslim, right? Go into the religion of your forefather Abraham and become a submitter, right? So he asked, doesn't that also count for Jesus, right? Because Abraham was the father of Islam, and so Jesus came like Moses and Muhammad. He came after Abraham, and shouldn't they also do the pilgrimage, like to go to Mecca, right? To do the pilgrimage because it's one of the pillars of Islam, and was like the people who were living in Jerusalem and Jesus also, was that also a commandment from God to them to make the pilgrimage? And if so, was it at that time maybe the pilgrimage counted the pilgrimage in Jerusalem as well as a pilgrimage? I don't
So,
know if the
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So, I mean, the thing is that we know that God gave the practices to Abraham, and all the messengers preach one and the same religion. So, just like you don't see any difference between Muhammad and Rashad, there was no difference between Muhammad and Jesus and Moses. You know, they were all preaching the same message, the exact same practices, the same salat, the same 2.5% charity. Nothing was different, you know. So, they're all exactly the same.
Yeah, so did they do also Hajj?
Yeah.
Like did
Yeah,
Moses
yeah.
went Mecca and Jesus did not, I think, but I don't know. Were there
Yeah, I mean, whether they went or not themselves, the fact is that it is part of the religion, you know, and it was the same religion. They were I mean, they were required to do the same thing. Now, the way the history came to us on who went and who didn't and all of that, I mean, we can't rely on that, right? I mean, even the Bible itself, we see all of these things have been distorted so much that there's just been replaced. Everything about Abraham has been replaced by circumcision, right? And so nothing is there to show exactly what Abraham was given. But we understand that from the Quran that it talks about Jesus and Mary doing their contact prayers, and so we know that they were following the same Abrahamic practices that God gave to Abraham. So there's no doubt about that.
eh, yeah, so is there any information in the Bible, in the Old and the New Testament
There is
about Mecca, like going
there's
to do pilgrimage?
there's some stuff that's available, but yeah, you have to really dig into it to see it, but it does talk about it. Yeah. but it's not very clear. You have to really. I came across it a while ago, so maybe if I find it again, I'll share it with you.
Yeah, so what I know is that Medina, the old name was Yathrib, if I'm not mistaken, and it was like a Jewish city, right? And this city is close to Mecca, right? And if people, the Jewish people, if they come from Israel, like that area, um, maybe that's also a thing that they went to Mecca to do the pilgrimage, and that's part of it because they believe that Abraham, was a prophet of God, and that he went to Mecca, right? Or I don't know if they don't.
Sorry, you said
Yeah,
Abraham?
so they believe in Abraham, the prophet Abraham. The Jews and the Christians, they both believe
Yeah.
in Abraham, and Um, so then they know that Abraham went to Mecca, right, to build the Kaaba.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, they have the truth now in the Quran. The Quran confirms all these practices. So rather than going by history or even trying to dig into the Bible, what they should do is they should read what God says in the Quran. And I mean, it's very easy to understand what they did. I mean, even if you try to do like a scholarly study in the Bible, I mean, still it's very confusing. And I mean, parts of the truth is there, right? But it's very difficult to understand. And yeah, so I mean, it is very convoluted, and you can't really go by history or what people believe among the Jews and Christians about Abraham. So I mean, if you really want to understand Abraham or Moses or Jesus, you should not go by the Bible. You should go by the Quran. Because God has sent the Quran to settle all of these disputes, to clarify things for people. So even to try to find it in the Bible, I mean, you know that the Bible is corrupted, right? So God has sent you the Quran to make your life easier for this reason. So why not just read what God says in the Quran? Um,
Yeah, I think the reason why he asked was he was searching for a link between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and actually the 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 first link is Abraham, right? Because
Searching for the
all of
missing
them
link.
they believe in Abraham. Sorry.
He was searching for the missing link.
No, no, no. The link, like the thing that all the three so-called
Yeah,
religions
I mean, so
believe
the
in.
link is God. God has given us the link in the Quran, right? So I mean, there's parts of the truth are there, right? So I mean, how much link does he want? That like, I mean, there's enough. We know enough from the Quran to understand that the Quran confirms the truth, right? So
Yeah.
whether or not he can find it in the Bible doesn't change anything. Now that you have the Quran, you have a mathematically proven scripture. You know that everything you read is from God, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, this just doesn't isn't it to me isn't that's a lot simpler than trying to find it in the Bible. I mean, why is he trying to find it in the Bible? Was he a Christian or something before?
No, no, no. He was a Sunnite, and he just came up with this question about Jesus, and he asked, "Is there any link, like because God told Prophet Muhammad to follow the religion of his forefather Abraham, so and you have the five pillars, and he needs to follow the five pillars. The same counts for Moses and Jesus as well."
Yeah, so
And
you just basically tell him that, yeah, I mean, they were following the same thing, but you don't. The Bible has been. It's not in the same form that it was revealed to, Jesus, the gospel, right? And so we don't have that, right? And so
yeah.
people have changed it, and so what we understand from the Quran is that they followed. What you need to, I think, tell him is that uh, they followed the exact same practices. Jesus was a submitter, just like Abraham, and the same commandments were given to him, just like
Yeah.
Abraham, and
Yeah,
same
so
for
pilgrimage to Kaaba
yeah,
is just
hmm
exactly the same, and
exactly,
they should. That's
yes,
actually the main thing, what you mean, right? And then,
yeah,
actually, that's also what I told him. Like, because they came after Abraham, like maybe Moses went to Kaaba. We don't know. Maybe he did Hajj, but we know that because they came after Abraham, and God tells the Prophet Muhammad to follow the religion of Abraham. So the same comes for them. I told them, yeah, that was actually the main thing, the main idea that they also need to do actually pilgrimage if they can, and go to
yeah,
Kaaba,
yeah.
to Mecca to do the pilgrimage. Thank you.
And I'm sure that, mashallah, you know that verse. I don't know the exact verse, but when Moses wanted to marry that girl, the father said, like, the condition was a number of pilgrimage. So the pilgrimage was their measure, to say like how many years he was supposed to work for him. So it existed at the time of Moses. Well, we don't know whether he did it or not, and we actually don't care, but we know that he was following the same things. So I actually have a question. What you said about Abraham, and the everything that remains from Abraham is just that lie about circumcision. So there's nothing, no evidence of nothing written about like a prayer or anything like the pillars in the previous books, the Old Testament and New Testament.
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, my question is, so in the Old Testament and the New Testament, there is no evidence of Abraham like bringing prayer or like the charity or Hajj or anything. It's just that they deleted everything, and also just the lie for circumcision exists in the
That's
previous
yeah. I mean,
testament.
that's what I've seen.
Okay,
Right? The only thing they know about Abraham is circumcision, and that
okay.
he was a prophet.
So
Like
I have
they
a
don't even
question
know
about.
like what makes him a prophet.
Oh, okay,
So,
okay.
but his scripture was his
Practical, yeah.
the practices that were given, right? And
Mm-hmm.
actually it's interesting because God says they distort the scripture with their own hands,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay, and also going back to Jafar, to your question, so it is mentioned in the book of Psalms in chapter 84. It says the valley of Becca, right? So we know the another name for Mecca is Becca, and it says, "Blessed is the man whose strength is in thee, in whose heart are the ways of them, those who passing to the valley of the Becca, they make it a spring. Also blessing the first rain will give. They go from strength to strength. Every one of them in Zion appeareth before God."
Can you repeat the verse number, brother?
I'll share the link with you. It's Book of Psalms, chapter 84. From Wikipedia. Oh, Oh shoot.
Yeah, it's a Wikipedia page.
Mm-hmm.
It contains
Mm-hmm.
the verse in the Quran and also this chapter in the Bible. Thank you, brother.
You're welcome.
So it is possible that also Sabbath was part of the like early practices, but then it was abrogated, right? Because they started arguing about it.
So God says that He just gave it to them, the Jews,
Or just the
and the
Jews? Okay.
yeah, and the Christians. They ended up disputing it, and that was it.
But based on what we talked about, so whatever was given to them was from Abraham, or maybe not. Maybe it's just what happened to the Jews. Okay. So, brother, please also change the title because it's saying like Farsi from the previous, like later after the study. If you could do that. Yeah. The title is still in Farsi, I mean, not in English.
Oh, oh, oh! I forgot to save it. When I did change it, but I forgot to save it. That's why. Oh, thanks for noticing that. It says Farsi, yeah. Well, now it should change, but it's not going to reflect on YouTube until later. So, okay. So, God willing, I want to read part of Appendix 9. It talks about uh, Abraham, the original messenger of Islam. So, I mean, this is one of those things that people use to mislead people, right? So it says, God willing, I'll just read later part of it. It says Millat Ibrahim. It says Islam is called Millat Ibrahim, religion of Abraham, throughout the Quran. Moreover, the Quran informs us that Muhammad was a follower of Abraham. Um, 16:123. Due to the general Due to a general unawareness of the fact that Abraham was the original messenger of Islam, many so-called Muslims challenge God. If the Quran is complete and fully detailed as claimed by God, where can we find the number of rakats in each contact prayer, salat? We learn from the Quran that all religious practices of Islam's submission were already established before the Quran's revelation. Verse 16, 123 is the direct proof that all religious practices in Islam were intact when Muhammad was born. Muhammad was enjoined to follow the religion of Abraham. If I ask you to buy a color TV, it is assumed that you know what a color TV is. Similarly, when God enjoined Muhammad to follow practices of Abraham, such practices must have been well known. Another proof of divine preservation of the Islamic practices given to Abraham is the universal acceptance of such practices. There is no dispute concerning the number of rakats in all 5 daily prayers. This proves the divine preservation of salat. The Quran's mathematical code confirms the number of rakats in the 5 prayers. 2, 4, 4, 3, and 4 respectively. The number 2, 4, 4, 3, 4 is a multiple of 19. So the Quran deals only with practices that were distorted. For example, the distorted ablution is restored in 5-6 to its original 4 steps. The tone of voice during the contact prayers was distorted. Many Muslims pray silently. This was corrected in the Quran 17:110. The fasting during Ramadan was modified in the Quran to allow intercourse during the night. Zakat is restored in 6:141, and Hajj is restored to the 4 correct months. See Appendix 15. So this appendix talks about how Abraham was the original messenger of submission, and God gave all the practice to Abraham, and also talks about how the Quran is complete, perfect, and fully detailed, and it only talks about the practices that were distorted. Now, obviously, some people try to use this as a loophole to suggest that there are other practices that were given to Abraham that are not here, and they're not mentioned because they were not distorted. But God says that with the idea of the color TV, for example, I mean, the practices, it talks about the Quran dealing with practices that were distorted. It's referring to the details, right? And if you look at the examples, it talks about like the tone of the voice of the contact prayer, and the fasting, the intercourse during fasting, and the zakat being restored, and Hajj being restored to the right months. So people use that to say that because circumcision was not a distortion, that it's not mentioned in the Quran. But I pointed out earlier also that if you look at in Appendix 33, it says that the Messenger of the Covenant has clearly pointed out also that everything that the Muslims do, this is on page 481, is wrong. The first pillar, Shahada, the call to Salat, prayer, Azan, the ablution, the daily Salat prayers, the Zakat, charity, Hajj, and all practices of Islam. So he's saying basically everything that they were doing is wrong, you know. And so it's not because it is pristine, pure and perfect that it's not mentioned. Even the Quran, it mentions the practices, but what it means in Appendix 9 is that, you know, just the details of those things are not mentioned because, you know, they were already established and being followed the right way. So only the details of the things that needed to be different were mentioned, right? And it makes perfect sense from a logical perspective as well. And so that's why, you know, it is what it is. So. Okay, so are there any other comments or questions? If not, uh, God willing, we can conclude our study. So thank you all for joining us. God willing, our next English Quran study would be on Saturday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. God bless you all. Assalamu alaikum.